Freedom for me is owning my life and living my dreams.
For me, freedom is when every single woman is financially independent.
For me, freedom is walking on the street at any time.
For me, freedom means to feel safe outside the house, irrespective of the time in the clock.
Freedom mean to me is something like to be unabashedly myself without thinking about what the other person is thinking about me or what I am thinking about me. Just like be myself truly and sincerely. Thank you.
True freedom for me is being liberated from everything, even from myself.
It's a place where we can be who we want to be and express ourselves, love whoever we want to without any judgment and fear.
Religion unites, never divides, and freedom for me is going at any religious place because every religion is teaching us how to love others and how to be more humble.
Freedom for me is about express our views.
Freedom for me is freedom from any kind of judgment, stereotypes and opinions.
Freedom to me is the right to live and let live.
Well, for me, freedom is ability to express myself the way I want.
Thank you. Thank you too much. So I will come back in a few minutes on this extract. So first of all, thank you to all of you, to all the people who are here tonight. I'm very impressed to see so many of you, it's true, to attend a discussion which is not certainly the obvious choice on the eve of this very long weekend Diwali that we are on the point of celebrating. So happy Diwali to all of you and happy Diwali to all of your family. The one you love and the people who loved you. So I would like to, but I would like to think that there is so many people because of the subject itself, freedom, and of course because of the quality of our panelists tonight. Today's discussion is part of a series of events organized by the UNIC Delhi cluster. UNIC is a club of European National Institute of Culture. And we are honored to have with us tonight Mrs. Ljubika Pevek, who from the Slovenian embassy and who is the current president of this UNIC cluster of Delhi. And she will say a few words after this project. As you have seen in the short video, we have asked our students of Alliance Française, what freedom means to them. These answers are very interesting. They show the great diversity of what young people in India expect today. In a country where, apparently, you will discuss that about it today, the political system is a democratic one. In a country where political independence has been achieved, but also where some issues still exist. Maybe not on paper, but in real life, like equality between the sexes, sexual freedom, financial independence, religious liberty, security, and a few things that they expressed tonight. We will also, tonight, in fact, we will discuss the political aspect of it, this concept, which doesn't mean that it's a more important one than the one I just quoted. But the concept of freedom, as we have just seen, is wide and open to many interpretations, to many, many definitions. And when I say political, I don't mean it in the politician side meanings, but I mean about from the Greek definition of polis, the governance of the city. Our distinguished guest will then speak about this concept of freedom and how it relates to democracy, and will ask themselves, as well as all of you, are these two concepts still compatible? I will leave our moderator this evening the task of introducing Professor Nicolas Tenzer and Professor Ramin Jahanbegloo. But I will say a few words about Dr. Krishnaswamy. Dr. Krishnaswamy teaches at the Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities. He is also co-director of the Center for Social and Political Research. He has a PhD from University of Delhi in philosophy. His research interests cross various disciplines. He works on issues concerning the philosophy of mind, particularly its relation to Husserlian phenomenology. I'm not sure that I understood the last sentence I just read. You will try to explain this to us very quickly. Thanks very much, Dr. Krishnaswamy, for accepting this very demanding role, especially with these two very talkative and very interesting people we have tonight. Just before to give the floor to Ljubika, I would like to thank the cultural and technical team of the Alliance Française for organizing this event, and to express my gratitude to the Preban Kaitan Foundation for their generous help and support. Personally, I want to thank Mr. Sandy Butoria for his constant support. And we have with us this evening the representative of the foundation, Preban Kaitan Foundation, Mrs. Nilama Dalmia Adar, from EA's Women of Delhi, who would like to felicitate our guests this evening. Please. Preban Kaitan Foundation is a foundation based in Calcutta and supports all activities, all projects regarding literature and also, how do you say that? Alphabetization. Literacy. And literization. Literacy, thank you. Thank you very much, Mrs. Nila. Okay, can I call Ljubika Pavek, President of the Unique Cluster? You can stay on, it's up to you. Who will say a few words about this important project that has been conducted by the different European cultural centers in Delhi.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. Welcome to the 5th event out of 11 for the Freedom Project organized by the Unique Cluster New Delhi. The Freedom Project has been a grand success so far, and I think we need to applaud each and every one of you for your contribution in making it successful. As you know, UNIC stands for European Union National Institutes for Culture, a network of organizations engaged in cultural relations. Together with our partners, we bring to life European cultural collaborations in more than 100 countries worldwide with a network of 136 clusters, drawing on the board experience of our members from all EU member states and associate countries. And we are growing. If that does not speak for diversity and inclusion, I don't know what else will. It is through culture that we build trust and understanding between the people of Europe and the wider world. We work to make culture count in international relations and leverage on the power of culture to bring people and communities together to build greater understanding and dialogue. This is done by promoting a deep interaction in the areas of arts, creative industries, tourism, youth, human rights, digitalization, and education, to name the few. The UNIC Cluster New Delhi has 16 members and 2 associate members engaged in cultural and related activities beyond our national borders. We are always focusing on what unites us rather than our differences. We have created and delivered projects connecting different authors from around the world in interesting, engaging dialogues with the Indian public with the long nights of literature. Our ongoing project, ULAT for Culture, has been instrumental in connecting Indian, Latin American, and European youth to diplomats and key experts. This interchange has enabled a better understanding between India, Latin American, and European nations. We have had a great project in moving Kolkata Moving, which finally moved to Delhi, so that we were able to enjoy a great photo exhibition created by the Spanish and French duo, who I must say captured the life and spirit of Calcutta in pictures. And here we are tonight, debating and exploring freedom, each of us having its own interpretation and explanation. We look forward to you connecting with us on social media, where you will find further details. I'm thrilled to be part of this event organized by Alliance Française, with a panel of prominent and interesting guests. Wishing you a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Ljubika. Dr. Krishnaswamy, Professor Tenzer, Professor Jahanbegloo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be part of this conversation as a facilitator. I'm myself very invested, like I'm sure all of you, in the concepts of freedom and democracy. So what I'm thinking of doing is, introduce the speakers, and then I have a set of 4 or 5 questions, and then I can open the floor for more questions from you, and then we can take it from there. Okay? So, Professor Nicolas Tenzer, he's currently the editor of the journal La Banquette and is the founding president of the Centre d'études et de réflexion pour l'action politique, CIRAP, a position he has held since 1986. He was the director of the Aspen Institute from 2010 to 2015 and has acted as its treasurer and president. Professor Ramin Jahanbegloo is also a colleague of mine. He's presently the executive director of the Mahatma Gandhi Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies, and he's also the vice dean of the School of Law at Jindal Global University, Delhi, India. He received his BA and MA in philosophy, history, and political science. So let's get to the topics. But before I get to the topics, I want to say that I've been reading this book that they co-wrote. It's a series of conversation about different political concepts and issues that are currently alive. And I must say this is an excellent read, and it opened up a lot of questions. I don't think we will have time to ask and go through so many issues that they have discussed here, but I will take my cue from the title, and I wanted to ask both of you how you look at democracy and freedom, because ever since the time of Alex de Tocqueville, the question of democracy and freedom, there's a certain tension between these two values, if you will. So Tocqueville noticed it in America, but the issue still remains. Do you think they are compatible or incompatible? I would like to know what your views are on them. I will start with Ramin.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. And I'm very happy to share this panel with 2 very close friends of mine, and somebody who I've known for more than 30 years, Nicolas, and Chris, who's a younger person, and I've known him for the past few years at Jindal. Now, the question of democracy and freedom that you have asked me is very interesting question, and it's I think that I will go before even pre-Tocqueville, because I think I like to approach it in a very didactic way, so we could have a better conversation, and I can have a better conversation with Nicolas. Of course, I think that freedom and democracy are distinct. They are separate philosophical and political concepts, but they are notions that are very closely interrelated. So it's practically impossible to think of democracy and not to talk about freedom, and it's practically impossible to be engaged in freedom and not wanting to realize this freedom in a form of, in a democratic form, I would say. But it all depends on how we define democracy and freedom. And I would like to take, for example, freedom. If we start by freedom before democracy, one definition of freedom would be to say that freedom is a product of human beings. It's a product of human civilization. And this is, I will go in the sense of what Hayek said, for example. Hayek, the Austrian economist, he did not believe that freedom was something natural, because he didn't believe in natural rights. So for him, freedom was the result of the evolution of societies toward democracy, and that's how freedom meant something. But if you take somebody like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he would say exactly the opposite. He would say men were born free, and this is, as you know, in the social contract, le contrat social, men were born free, but they are all in chains everywhere in every society. So that means that men were freer in nature than in culture or in civilization, and it's the natural capacities and capabilities of human beings which make their freedoms and not just the political and social possibilities. Now here there is one point which becomes very, very important. It has been always very important in my life, actually, because I was born in Iran, I grew up in France, and now I live partly in India, partly in Canada. Now, so I have had several engagements, political engagements and struggles in my life. I've struggled for French society. I've struggled for Iranian society. I continue fighting for Iran, actually, right now. And I continue fighting also if there is a problem like the indigenous problem in Canada. So why is it important? Why I'm saying this? Because I think there is no freedom without struggle for freedom. We cannot define freedom. Freedom is something that we can define it only in action. I do it in a very Arendtian way, you know. Freedom can only be freedom as action. And here, I want to be much provocative. I know some of you would not like it, and especially some of my French friends who are already sitting in this room. And I want to say a quote of Jean-Paul Sartre, which I actually have quoted it many times in my adventures with Iran or others. If you remember Sartre, he has a very interesting quote. He says that the French people were never as free as under the occupation of the Nazis. This is a famous quote from Sartre. And I always tried, I mean, I'm sure that it's the same thing with Nicolas. I always tried to argue that in the sense of beyond, I would say, the French society. For example, taking Sartre and bringing it into Iran and say, okay, we are living under a theocracy and a very oppressive mullah regime. Can we say that we have never been as free as we are today because they're killing us and they put us in jail? I went to jail for 125 days. Can we say that? But yes, philosophically we can say it, though we suffer and we do not accept it. But why? Because for the time being, we are fighting and we are in the practice of realizing freedom and the practice of making freedom. And this is where democracy comes in very quickly before giving the floor to my friend. Democracy cannot succeed unless those who express their freedom are ready to fight for it. So democracy, in one word, is not a nursery. Today's democracies have become nurseries, okay? And they have become insurance companies, actually, I would say, because people are asking for being assured from their democracies. French people ask from Macron, you have to assure us that everything is going to go well. And this is how we can, you have to assure us that this winter we're going to have heating because of the war in Ukraine. But it's not a nursery, actually. Citizens cannot be free in a democracy if they don't go on fighting. So democracy is the guarantor of freedom, certainly, but freedom disappears as soon as people are no more passionate for democracy and they just cease to and stop to fight and become complacent and conformist. So I think these are several points which I think are very key points when we are distinguishing between freedom and democracy.
Thank you, Ramin. Thank you to all of you. Well, basically, I think exactly the same as Ramin. I think basically there is no freedom without willingness to take action. And they're taking, as Hannah Arendt put it, the risks of action. That's what I mean, the people who are revolting against totalitarian regime, like in Russia, like in Iran, like in Cuba, like in Venezuela, like in Burma, like in many countries concretely are doing. And I think that basically what they are demonstrating is also that there is absolutely no cultural backgrounds or civilizational backgrounds behind the fight for freedom. I mean, there is a kind of cultural thinking or natural thinking behind, I mean, the minds of many people who say, well, basically, if, let's say, the Chinese will be never ready for freedom, or the Russians will be never ready for freedom, or the Muslims will be never ready for freedoms. And the facts are just belying this theory. In fact, when we see what the people are doing or were doing, because the movement has been suppressed by people, the Republic of China, in the street of Hong Kong, when you see what the people are doing, you know, sometimes in the streets of Moscow, in Iran right now also, I mean, it means that it doesn't mean to be a kind of Westerner or to know about important books like Rousseau, Locke, Hobbes, or Machiavelli, or I mean, any other, even they haven't read, I mean, the Bill of Rights or the Declaration of Human Rights. That's not the point. Sometimes some of them are illiterate, but they have the freedom in their very heart of heart. And I think that we must have this idea to see that, I mean, the questions of freedoms, which is very intimately tied to human rights, belongs to everyone, or may belong to everyone. And, of course, we may have these freedom movements without a democracy. But if we want to realize freedom and to achieve freedom, we must have democracy. There is no democracy without freedoms, and there is no freedoms as experienced and guaranteed in a regime without democracy. I think that's something that we must have in mind. But having said that, not all democracies, in fact, are respecting freedom. You may have formal democracies that, in fact, are not giving to the minorities, to the women, to some peoples, for any reasons, the right to be free. And there is another thing, which is that in some democracies, and that was already, you were mentioning Tocqueville, Tocqueville was mentioning, in which you may have democracies, but not the freedom in the mind of the people. And Tocqueville, for instance, instead, it said that in the US, you know, in the mid-90s, 80s, there were, for instance, sometimes no willingness to publish some books that may disrupt the common thinking. And so he said that this regime did better than the Inquisition in Spain, because just the people do not have ideas to publish some books. Whereas during the Inquisition in Spain, you had some people taking the risk to publish those kinds of books, which is completely different. So we must have in mind that basically, when it comes to freedoms, we have to consider basically three entities. Those three entities are the state, the society, and the individual. And there is no society, there is no freedom, without the individuals, which is the ability through educations and through protest, but also because it is guaranteed by the state and by the society. There is no freedom without the individuals that must be put at the very center of everything. And in some countries, you have the state endangering the freedom of the individual. That's the case, for instance, in dictatorships, like in Russia, like in China, like in Iran. I could quote, unfortunately, very many countries. And then, if you have a civil societies, in those countries, the civil society could protect the individual. Whereas, in some other countries, you have the society, or when I'm talking about society, I could mean as well the community, that is attempting to appropriate for itself the rights of the individual. So if sometimes you have the society, the cultural mood, the communities depriving the individual for his or her rights, and then the state could be the protector. Because the state could say to those communities or groups, you must not, you cannot, you are not allowed to infringe the private sphere of each individual. And in this private sphere, any kind of individual could have or not have his or her own beliefs, his or her sexual orientations, could have the right to read any books that he or she is willing to read. And this person could publish anything. There is absolutely no taboo that could restrict the freedom of the individual. So I don't want to be too long at that stage, but I think it's quite decisive to understand that the individual must come first. Because in some societies, also the individual could think that he or she is free. But in fact, he is just following the mood. The word is not very much used those days, alienated. And that was what described very well the School of Frankfurt, alienated by the common thinking, by the mood, by the advertisement, by the groups. And the true question then is basically to free this individual from the group. And just to end with this very quick introduction, I could say that basically, I think that the individual is free only if there is both a society and a government that is promoting the very idea of freedom. And that's basically a choice of civilization. That's why we can certainly consider the cultural diversity, but within this diversity, there must be a kind of unique goal, which is the liberations of the individual. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, you raised a lot of interesting issues, and as I was listening to both of you, one question came to my mind, and I thought that you were answering that particular question from two different perspectives. And so the question is, how can democracy be maintained as an institution? On the one hand, you were saying that you need a certain sense of affirmative action, a certain sense of reinforcement of the institutions which people must have promised themselves. So, in some sense, to use an analogy that a German philosopher used, it's unlike a clock that you set at the beginning. It's something that you have to reinforce through daily interventions. So, on the other hand, you talked about how you need different kinds of, there's a certain balance of power between the society and the state and the individual. And so with a certain configuration of that particular power distribution, that is one way of enforcing individual freedom. Which brings me to another question, which is, I mean, how do you see democratic institutions today in the geopolitical space that we live in? What do you think are the threats that endanger the the democratic constitution that we idealize?
Thank you. This is a very good question. Actually, I think to answer this question, it's good to come back for just 30 seconds to what Nicolas said, in the relationship between culture and democracy, or religion and democracy, or freedom. First of all, I think it should be clear to all of us that freedom is beyond cultures and religions. And that's very, very important to understand that. No culture, no religion can reduce or limit our right to be free. And that's very important because we live in a world of fundamentalisms. We are, at least in Europe, we are done with the Inquisition, but and some forms of fascist groups. But the danger is still there because they define. I mean, this definition that people is more important than freedom. Nation or nationalism is much more important than freedom of the individual. Your religion and how you act as a Jew or a Christian or as a Hindu is much more important than who you are. In that case, the question which you ask from these kids will have no sense anymore, because they are talking about their negative liberties. If I have to make the distinction of Isaiah Berlin, I did a book with Isaiah Berlin many years ago, 30 years ago, and Isaiah Berlin is well known as a theorist, as the greatest liberal of 20th century, and he makes this distinction between positive liberty and negative liberty. Negative liberty is about non-interference, and that's very important for liberalism, for classical liberalism. So democracy cannot exist, first thing, it cannot exist without negative liberty. That's practically impossible. You can have positive liberty, and positive liberty is actually very dangerous because it might end up with authoritarianism, because you're talking about always a higher self saying to a lower self, I'm part of a group, I'm part of a nation, I'm part of a religion, and you have to follow this line. Now, the threats of democracy, they come from this misunderstanding, I think, is very, very important. For example, we both talked in a very Hannah Arendtian way of why action is so important. Hannah Arendt talks about speech also in a very Greek way, speech and action. Why speech? Because people can be like the ancient Greeks, like Socrates, outspoken. They call that paresia. You have to be outspoken. We are not outspoken. I think that very few of us, we will be outspoken in front of our ambassadors, will be outspoken in front of our bosses, in front of our vice chancellors, in front of our prime ministers. But being outspoken is very, very important. So this is part of our freedom. And democracy cannot continue being democratic if you don't have this paresia, you don't have this outspokenness. So why am I saying that? Because one of the threats which we, even in Europe, we have it, which we are actually feeling it and experimenting it, is citizen disengagement. Citizen disengagement is when you have a younger generation of French, Germans, Dutch, Spanish, Spaniards, Polish, who do not go and vote, who believe that there is no difference between Marine Le Pen and the French Socialist Party, who think that everybody is equal to everyone. Okay, so this disengagement is very, very dangerous, because in the long run, you lose your democratic passion, and the citizenship does not mean anything if you do not have democratic passion. So disengagement actually weakens citizenship and citizenry, and that, I think, is one of the problems. The second problem, I think, is the question of technology and social media especially. And we actually experimented that with Mr. Trump, fake news actually. And we don't know where is the truth. And don't forget that somebody like Václav Havel, half of his writings, like Gandhi, is about living in truth. His fight against the communist regime and what he called the post-totalitarian regime was about do not lie like the communist regime, be in truth, okay? Live in truth, work in truth, okay? So this technology, I think, which disseminates fake news, it's a very dangerous threat to democracy, because who's telling the truth? How should we understand what our prime minister is saying? How should we understand what our ministers are saying? How should we understand about, and it polarizes democracy. And I think if democracies become polarized, in the long run, they will be destroyed. And at least, I don't know what Nicolas thinks, but at least I think that that's a big problem. So, and this brings me to the most dangerous part, which is populism, which we are living it right now in many countries. We are living it in Russia, we're living it in Turkey, we're living it with Orban in Hungary, we're living it in with this idiot of Bolsonaro that I hope that he will not win the elections because he's going to destroy the other half of the Amazon. He already destroyed half of it, and just think of all these kids of ours who are going on the streets as passionate citizens at the age of 16, 15, 12, fighting for climate change, and you have a stupid president, populist president, who can always, by himself, destroy half of the Amazon. So populism is very dangerous because it's always a power of speaking on behalf of the people and not giving the speech to the people. And that's why the people will only be present in the public space as part of this populism and not separate from it. Well, we saw how fascism, Nazism came to Europe in this way. It became, remember the Dreyfus affair and how people were shouting death to Dreyfus, death to Dreyfus before people like Zola and others could come and say the contrary. Well, they did not incriminate the French army because it was all about French nation, and that, okay, even if we lose the war against the Germans, we have our pride. And so we can put a Jew in jail, but we keep our pride. So populism is, I think, is a very dangerous point. And last but not least, I think what we're living with in globalization is economic inequality. I think in economic inequality driven by global economic forces is going to destroy democracy. It's a big threat in democracy. And let me tell you one thing that we too are living in a corporate university like Jindal, in a private university, is the corporate mindset. You know, in this kind of universities, you will not find humanists of the Middle Ages. You will not find Thomas Morris. You will not find Erasmus. Well, who do you find? You find a very strong human resources, which has most of the administrators, and you have always people talking about excellence, but not giving excellence to the students and the professors. On the contrary, what is important for them is always numbers. How many students we have, how many professors we have. We have 1,000 professors at Jindal, and out of these 1,999 are without offices for the time being. So, this could be in the long run, the corporate mindset can be a very, very dangerous, element for democracy, because it's only counting. It's like charter accountants becoming always the prime ministers and presidents of a country, with no idea. The passion, democratic passion, is completely absent.
Thank you, Ramin. I mean, you were referring to the Dreyfus affair. It's also a point that I would like to mention. But since you talk about that, I think it's very important, because I think there is no freedom and there is no democracy as well without commitment to the truth. I mean, that's the very principles, which means, because it has social implications, it means that basically there must be a kind of trust vis-à-vis the institutions that represent the truth, basically the academia, the teachers, the scientists. There must be a knowledge of science. There must be a respect for the one who knows. And the problem that we are witnessing in many democracies is basically this distrust towards the main institutions, towards science. for many reasons. Some could be explained, some maybe could be good, because there was a kind of abuse of this kind of domination by some of them, certainly. But the consequence is that there is absolutely no trust, and that the truth and the lie become completely equal. And each person thinks, well, I know what is the truth. What is the truth? My opinion. And we see someone who could have, I don't know, 1 million followers on Twitter or whatever, could say, well, a kind of guru, whatever he or she is, that could say, well, I say some things about, let's say, the COVID-19 crisis, and we had this kind of guy in France, and you had a lot of believers. But in fact, which is very dangerous, because I am following the Russian propaganda very closely since many years, is that this kind of lost of, I mean, the fact that the people have lost any kind of repair, any kind of reference to the truth, is instrumentalized by authoritarian regimes, or mostly I would say totalitarian regime. Just see, for instance, the things that we were witnessing in many European countries. For instance, all the protests against the measures of restrictions against the COVID-19 crisis. You had, I mean, the vaccines, and you had the anti-vax movements because of that. You have the limitations and sometimes the lockdown. So you had the people protesting, I mean, these restrictive measures. And some people coined, and it was instrumentalized actually by Russia. Well, we don't live in the West in democracies any longer because of these restrictions. And you had some people in France who coined the idea sanitary dictatorship. In French, dictature sanitaire. And of course, it was, as I said, used by this totalitarian regime that is Russia, to say, you see, you don't live in democracy, but democracy in fact doesn't exist. So there is no difference between you, democracies, real democracy, even if imperfect democracy, and France is an imperfect democracy, as the UK, Germany, and many democracies are, certainly. But there is absolutely nothing common between, on the one hand, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Burma, under the military junta, etc., and democracies. And that's why those regimes, with the help of those populists that Ramin was talking about, like Bolsonaro and others, create really a kind of erasement of the democratic principles, values, and references. And you had some in those democracies believing a lot of narrative that are deadly wrong. You see, for instance, sorry, because I'm working a lot, you know, and I'm also the director of a journal, you know, on Russia and the post-Soviet space. I saw that, for instance, you had the propaganda coming from Russia, for instance, on the so-called Ukrainian Nazis, and you know certainly that only 1% of the Ukrainians voted for the far-right parties. I would be very happy in France to have, I mean, such a result, I must say. You have people saying, well, those people are murderers, they are committing genocide, whereas, in fact, only Russia is committing genocide, has slaughtered more than 100,000 of people there, including kids, probably more than 1,000 kids, women, unprotected persons. So is it, basically, I mean, democracy is under threat, but you have, I mean, in the West, people believing those lies. Because of the lack of education. And also because of something different, which is probably in part of the West, I mean, part of the West, not all the West, the lack of experience. If you see, for instance, what the Baltic states, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, Poland, Czech Republic, experienced, just 30 years ago or 35 years ago, they experienced the dictatorships and they experienced the fight for freedom. So they know better that the Western West, or the Western Europe more precisely, what the fight for freedom actually means. Because they have this memory of this fight. And that's something, of course, we cannot do much about. But part of the Western countries do not have this experience of the fight for freedom. And because of the lack of history teaching in many of the Western countries, even more probably in the US than in Europe, they do not know history. They just have forgotten the dark pages of history. There was recently in France and some other European countries an opinion survey about the knowledge of the Holocaust. And I think it was 30% as an average in many European countries of the people between 18 and 35 didn't know about the Holocaust. And I think if you don't have this historical memory, how can you be free? How can you support the people around the world, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and at the very center of Europe, who are fighting and sometimes losing their lives because of this fight? And the last thing is a question, because also, I'm working mostly right now on foreign policy and strategic affairs. There is also a question that was raised by a seminar held by the Brookings institutions in Washington, D.C. some years ago, which is, are the democratic regimes, all the democratic regimes, I will say, formal democracies, really behaving on the international stage as advocates of freedoms of democracy? Are they really faithful to their very principles? Are they supporting their democratic allies? And of course, in the case of Ukraine, I think that's a vital question. Because if we want to be free, we cannot just look away and close our minds and turn a blind eye to the atrocities. Basically, we cannot remain neutral. And for people who want to be free and who want to be democratic and to advance on the world stage and at home, the case for democracy, neutrality is not an option. Neutrality is a disgrace.
Thank you very much for your answers. We don't have a lot of time, but I have a lot of questions, but I don't want to ask those questions and deny you the right, possibly, to ask questions that you might have. So, is it okay if we open the floor to some questions from the audience?
I think we still have time, no? Yeah, we still have. Okay. Yeah, for the last question.
Sure. Okay. So then I'll go ahead with. You want to ask? We'll open the floor. Okay. So my question. What has happened now is that a lot of people have undermined. A lot of countries have undermined democratic values. Historically, if you look at it in the 19th century, democracy, there was a lot of motivation to ascribe to fight for democratic values like freedom. Many of the nationalist movements in Europe, Risorgimento and so on, was fought on the ideals of democracy, which kind of encouraged, what Rousseau called l'amour de soi, the love of oneself, the individual freedom. And so, and that trickled on, and then that had a spillover effect to the colonies, and a lot of countries espouse democracy as a way to get freedom. But now, as we all know, there are a lot of countries and people and intellectuals who have undermined democratic values. But how do you think democracy can still be a kind of a critical asset in today's geopolitical map, where on the one side you have people, Western countries who are liberal and democratic, on the others where you have countries which believe that democracy, more than democratic values, there are other values like, I don't know, geographical aggrandizement and so on and so forth, which can help, get a country further. So how do you understand this kind of tension, which is, visible everywhere between, values which are democratic and values which are, anti-democratic?
I think this is a very important question, but I want to come back to answer this question. I want to come back to what Nicolas was saying, especially because he was talking about the concept of memory. And since we're going to organize a conference on Paul Ricoeur here in February, which is, he's actually one of the French philosophers who worked very much on history, memory, and forgetfulness. It's the title of one of his late writings. I think there is such a thing, and if you go and read, for example, all the debates which was done in the 1980s in France on French Revolution by Furet and people of the Débat journal or Esprit, you can see that we can talk about such a thing as a democratic memory. There is such a thing as democratic memory, meaning that democracy, at least in European, I would say, countries, more than anywhere else, is part of the historical memory of European people. French Revolution, glorious revolution, but you have the 1789 human rights and citizens declaration, but you have also everything which has been done in 19th century. We talked about the Dreyfus affair. These are all, I think, part of this memory. And now my point is, if we, in the generations that we have today, as you were talking about Holocaust actually, if they forget about this democratic memory, what are they left with? How are they going to protect themselves against the threat that we were talking? How will they actually build the democracy, the European democracy of the future? It's the same thing in other countries, but in other countries, since we had a long period of dictatorship, like in Latin America or in the Middle East, which practically in no country except Israel, I know that some of you will not consider Israel as a democracy, but Israel is a democracy for Israelis at least. So in the Middle East, nowhere else we have democracy. So democracy has not been part of the historical memory of the Middle Eastern people, Arabs, Iranians, Turks. No one. It has never been there very solidly. But it has been solidly there in Europe, and we have to defend it. Now, how can we defend that? I think that the spirit of democracy cannot exist without taking risks. In different periods of democracy, we need to take risks. We need to think dangerously. We need to act dangerously, as Albert Camus used to say. We need to create dangerously. This danger is always there, but we have to take risk. But this risk is needed in the same way that Voltaire and Rousseau and Zola actually took risks when they were defending the opinions of the others. Why? Because one of the things which is very, very dangerous, actually, especially on the national level, I think, for democracy, is when what John Stuart Mill called as social tyranny. is when the public opinion itself becomes a social tyranny. For example, if tomorrow, I don't think that's going to happen, but, well, we have to think about it. If you have these populists in France who will turn the public opinion, the French public opinion, into a social tyranny, you know, in the same way that Trump has done it in America, you know, with the average white American. So that becomes a very dangerous point, that you have a public opinion which is actually putting the democracy into danger, and the elites, the democratic elites in their own political parties, they cannot do anything about it because they were thinking only of winning the elections or just competing with each other without necessarily actually thinking where the danger is coming from. So I think that's one of the points. The other point is the question that we are both part of the Forum 2000 that happens every year in Prague. And I've been part of Forum 2000 since Václav Havel was alive, because during my student time in France, I collaborated with the Eastern European dissidents. Now, we discussed a lot about this fact that non-democratic countries, they have alliances among themselves. Look at the alliance that exists between the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians in between, who give drones to the Russians to kill Ukrainians. It's incredible. I mean, when you think of it, why do Iranians do that? Because they need Putin, and they need the Chinese to support them so that they can continue killing their own people, you know? And they continue to have the supremacy and homogeneity, actually, and hegemony, sorry, having their hegemony in the Middle East. So I think that what we've been discussing about, and it's good for the diplomats who are present here, is a question of alliances. As in the past, fascists, and populists, they find their alliances immediately. But democratic countries, it takes them time to find their alliances, you know. Especially, I'm not talking about unique, and I'm not talking about, you know, this kind of institutions. I'm talking about a real, very strong institutions and alliances which can confront populist regimes, or even, let's call them autocratic and totalitarian regimes, and the danger which might come. So if they don't get engaged in a war, like it was the Second World War against Nazism, and these alliances, how will they be there, and how can they defend the democracies? So I think that this is what is important, is to have economic influences, it's important to have diplomatic influences, it's important to have, you know, this kind of debates that we're having, but have it at the level of schools, high schools, elementary schools, all the citizens that we can find who can talk about this democratic memory, because this democratic memory actually helps for people not to forget about the Holocaust, to know when you ask them who was Adolf Hitler, and they would not say that he was a rock and roll singer, you know, and to know exactly who they are pinpointing at, because this is what people like Putin and others are thinking about, that, okay, they consider us as good people. You know, they don't know anything about Russia. They don't know anything about what we did. So we can always play around with them. We can say, you know, we are very good people. And here, let me just complain and make a complaint that I've made already on the TV and with Karan Thapar in the interview I did for The Wire. The fact that the Indians are the only people who are not saying anything about the killing of young Iranians is that they want to have a good relationship with Iran. And secondly, they don't understand at all. They consider Iran as a very typical Shiite country with hands which are all not in blood, and they say that all these kids that are coming out, they are paid by the Americans. I mean, imagine a kid of 16 years old being paid by Mr. Biden or by NATO to come and shout against the Iranian regime. So this kind of, amalgam, I would say, is created by this danger that we are trying to talk about and the absence of democratic memory. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramin. Yes, exactly. I think it was really, a follow-up to what I said about the consistency of the alliances. The democracies must be consistent in their alliances, and they will not tolerate, for instance, I think that so-called allies basically, are not abiding by the very principles of democracies. That's absolutely vital. Just I will go back also to one point, which is also an answer to your questions about, history. Basically, if we consider, the practice of the totalitarian regime, like, populist communist China, Russia, Iran, and others, basically they are trying to erase, the past crimes of their history, the black pages of the history. And that's something that also kind of move that we can observe, within the far right in France as well. Remember, for instance, Zemmour, who was trying to rehabilitate Pétain, the head of the Vichy regime. That's exactly the same things. But basically, those totalitarian regimes, for instance, one of the signals was basically the fact that Russia liquidated Memorial in December. Memorial is one of the most important human rights organizations in Russia, protecting, the dissidents, but also saying the truth and about, the crimes of Stalinism. And you were witnessing in some years the rehabilitations of Stalin, in Russia. And so, basically, they want to erase this past memory of the crimes just to whitewash the crimes of the present. Crimes of the present, I have to recall that even in Syria, Russia actually killed more Syrian civilians than even ISIS did. Much more. And the crimes of the Putin regimes are much more in Ukraine, in Syria, in Georgia, in Chechnya before. Much more that, probably 50 times more, that all the crimes combined of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. That's just fact. And if we don't stick to the fact, we do not understand, the very things. So I was talking about the destructions of history and of the past by the totalitarian regimes. But there is also the unwanted destructions of the past by the democracies as well. That was exactly what I was mentioning. And this memory of the facts, I will just tell you a story, which is an European story. I'm traveling a lot for conferences, lectures, through the world, since many years. And I remember I was invited to give some speeches, in Serbia. It was at that time Serbia and Montenegro, still combined, twin country. Just 3 weeks after May the 29th, 2005. Probably May the 29th of France, for you, most of you, doesn't mean something. It was the day where most of the French voters decided to vote no to the project of the so-called European constitutions. And already we were witnessing, I was campaigning for the yes, of course, but you were witnessing a lot of people from the right or from the left saying, well, we have to protect the so-called sovereignty of France. And they basically were rejecting, in fact, many of them, also the democratic values. And the idea that we must move forwards towards a more united Europe. Of course, we could have a lot of criticism towards this project. I had also some criticisms. But the fact is that this move basically has a tremendous impact in all others, the EU countries. And even countries who had the hope, because it matters to reinforce their own democratic mindset, to join the EU. And it was Serbia. And I had a dinner in Serbia with a great guy who took the risk of actions. He was the head of Transparency Serbia. He was fighting against Milosevic. And he took the risk. He was imprisoned. There was a lot of assassination attempt against him. And in fact, this year, the Prime Minister, Janjic, was assassinated by the nationalist, far-right nationalists in Serbia. And so this guy told me, well, do you still, you French, have an historical consciousness? Historical consciousness. And historical consciousness means a lot, which is that if we think any kind of action, political actions, involvement, either domestic or international or European, without this idea of, well, what's the direction of history? How far are we faithful to the ones who gave their lives for freedom? Then really it becomes meaningless. That's the first thing. And the second thing what I want to call, which is also about the questions of nations, about also the European constructions, about the alliances, about the quest for democracy, is I remember a lot of discussions that I had with some French and European colleagues, including one of my French who has been a European commissioner, French European commissioners. And we had some debates. I shared their values. But he told me when I was talking in the midst of the 90s about the war, I mean the possibility or even the likelihood of a new war, about the questions of the evil, about the questions of, let's say, the pulsions of death, about the rise already at that times of, let's say, the strokes that received democracy. He told me, well, Nicolas, you are too pessimistic. The war will never happen again in Europe. And I said, well, just remember, we had an ongoing war in Europe. It was the war in the former Yugoslavia. But no, it was far away. It was just a kind of, let's say, romance of old communism. And he told me, well, you see, we have basically the economic development. And it was a kind of naive belief shared by many people around the world that economic development will bring peace, will bring democracy, will bring freedom. And it was completely naive. This kind of what we call sometimes kind of, evolutionisms or positivisms or developmentalisms, word was coined by Rostow in these years. In fact, not. Because those people were not considering the individuals. And last point, maybe not to be too long, with the question of the nations, because you were asking about the nations. And in fact, you had, some very famous quote by Jean-Jacques Jaurès, you remember, about nationalism and patriotism, saying that basically nationalisms basically create a kind of disfranchisement vis-à-vis the freedom and democracy, whereas patriotisms could be compatible with internationalism. And I think we have these words, and I think we could, of course, discuss a long time. I won't, of course, launch a discussion right now about these kind of things. Basically, a lot of nations discovered freedom in the fights for independence. That was true for India. That was true for African countries. And that was true as well for the Baltic states, for Ukraine, for Moldova, for Belarus. Because all those countries, in India, in African countries, and some other Asian countries, in Latin America, at different stages of their histories, they were fighting for freedom through the very idea of nation. And when we have this new surge of neo-colonialisms, neo-imperialisms from Russia, from China somehow, and from other countries, I say, well, you nations who were free, have you really forgotten your past? And that national identity, when it goes along, goes hand in hand with freedom, is something that we have to promote, which is just the contrary of step-born and close-minded nationalism.
Now we can open the floor for more questions from the audience. So I'm seeing you and then the lady in the black.
Good evening, everyone. So my basic question is, can democracies be successful in every society in the world? I'm asking this question because we are having examples of Iraq and Afghanistan right in front of us, where stable regimes were brought down for democratic experiments but ended up as failed states, paving way for the development of terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and Taliban, which became headaches for democracies and threats to freedom of people around the world.
No, I will answer very shortly. No. For too short answer, no. Yeah, as you can see it, you gave an example of Taliban, and you have the example of Iran, and many other examples. Why? Because a democracy can be successful only with a democratic culture. You cannot have a regime of mullahs or a regime of Taliban and say at the same time that no, we want to have a democracy. There are no, without being essentialist, there is no way that somebody who believes in any form of theocracy at the same time can say that he or she is a democrat or democratic. And that's the whole point. And this is where you see this the struggle between the two concepts come in. Actually, these are actually, I would say, in my own work I call them a struggle of legitimacies. These are two forms of different legitimacies. One being a theocrat, for example, since we're talking about Taliban and Iran, good examples is theocratic legitimacy, is the government of God, is the governmentality of God, and the other one is the government of the people. So people, I know a lot about Islam, and actually I taught Islam. In fundamentalist Islam of say somebody like Sayyid Qutb, for example, where you have the Muslim Brotherhood following him, the governmentality of the people is the governmentality of ignorant and immature people who need to have somebody tell them what to do. Okay, democracy is where you consider people as mature in a very Kantian way. You know, you have actually exited yourself incurred immaturity, and you have become mature, and you can say, I dare to think about the public space. Now, so this, when you have this contradiction, democracy, of course, cannot be there.
Basically, I won't answer long, but just a follow-up remark to what Ramin said, which I agree fully. Which is, I mean, the question of values, because you were also asking the question of values, we hadn't time to address that. I mean, but I mean, it's completely related to your questions. I mean, basically, you have different kind of systems of values. From a scientific point of view, no one can say what is the best system of values. It's basically a question of choice. But I know what my choice is. And I know what's the choice of, I guess, the majority of the people. And so I think the real questions, it's not to make abstract comparisons between the different kind of systems, but to understand and to make people understand what the consequences of their choices. And in my view, there are choices that are just untenable. Not only they could be, I mean, morally disgustful, that's not the point, but they are basically untenable if you want to develop a country if you want to develop the amenity of life of the people, the security of the people, the sense of, I will say, absence of jeopardize of the people. I mean, we have to protect the private sphere. And if we don't protect the private sphere, I mean, basically, there is no society that could develop itself. Of course, I will say that, but I mean, the idea that the people could be free to choose another regime is a kind of internal contradictions. If they choose another regime, most of the time not because they have chosen this regime, but because it was imposed to the people through many different kind of tools. Could be threats, could be, I was mentioning the word, alienations, propaganda, and that's something that we were witnessing in the kind of regimes that Ramin was talking about, the Mullah regime or the Taliban's, the diseducations. And especially, I would say, the diseducations, in Afghanistan especially, of the girls. And sometimes I would say the girls and the women will save the world, I think, because, I mean, basically, I think that's something which is not, I mean, very practical. In many developing countries, the girls and the women had the crucial roles in the development. And sometimes the oppressions start with the girls, as we see in Iran, as we see, in Afghanistan, and in many countries.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for this, for the Freedom Project and for this fascinating discussion on the question of is democracy and freedom incompatible. I feel that there are more than around 200 countries in the world, and many countries, all the countries are independent. Last country, big country, Namibia became independent from South Africa, and after that all the countries are already independent. So we are living in a post-colonial world, so to say, and I feel that all the countries are independent, but as you said, as the discussion said, that countries in the Middle East, Islamic countries, and the Russia, China, they are not democratic. They are still, I mean, a single-party rule, or they are autocracies. So, I mean, if the country is not democratic, I mean, even if the countries which are democratic, even if imperfect, they can give a chance for individual freedom. At least there is a chance for people to demand freedom. And if they are not democratic, like most of the countries in the world are there, then there is no chance. I mean, the government doesn't give a chance to the people for individual freedom, like in China or Russia and in the Middle Eastern Islamic countries. So, but my point is that if we compare India with China, like China also calls itself a democracy. I don't know if a single party rule can be called a CCP rule, Chinese Communist Party rule can be called as a democratic country. But it's unique in the sense that China is really unique because they have developed very fast because of this single party rule. Like democracy is a slow process. Like in India, there is multi-party democracies on any issue of national importance or national development, of international geopolitics ramifications, the party in power has to debate and discuss it in parliament, and the opposition parties, they oppose it, and they don't come to a common point, and they don't, consensus is difficult to come about. And in China, they can, I mean, take the, like if we take the example of India and China, population is almost same now. India is undertaking. So my question is that, in China, because it is a very strong country, because they have they are economically and economically very strong, and they are politically also very strong because they are the P5 veto. They are having the veto power. So the population, they could control the population. The country can develop economically very fast. And at the same time, India, being a democracy, population could not be controlled, and economically also we are weaker. China is 5 to 6 times more economically stronger. Per capita income is 5 to 6 times more. So I mean, so that is a good point of maybe it's not a democracy, but that is a good point. It is good for the people of China, and China commands respect, and they command power in the world. That is what I. Thank you.
Nicolas, to ask.
Well, I mean, I won't talk about India. I mean, certainly not the experience of India and the question of the development of India, which is, I mean, certainly a question that could be mostly addressed to the Indian audience, certainly. Especially because it's also out of my field, which is mostly, I mean, philosophy and foreign policy. I can talk a little bit, you know, about China and the question of China and about the questions of the competitions between China and democracies. I think that you have a lot of limits of the Chinese model. Also, that we are actually witnessing, you know, probably the Chinese model and the idea that there could be a kind of continuous growth, you know, in China in the coming decades. I'm not sure that much. Also, it's a growing country, as you certainly know, and certainly it's not a democratic country. And the question is, how is China? Is China able also to envisage some changes, you know, in this government? Who is able to build, I mean, a new kind of model? And I think that. With, I mean, the new empowerment, you know, of the leaders in China, China becoming certainly more totalitarian than it used to be even, you know, 15 years ago, I think I am even less confident of the Chinese regime to develop the question. The question is also where is China really heading to? I mean, communist China, because in fact there are two Chinas, there are two Chinese countries. Don't forget. And you have one country which is successful, Taiwan, and one country which seems to be successful because it's very powerful and more powerful because of the people, because of the size of the territory. But sometimes, I mean, may face a huge problem, which is also another point. I mean, for the West. I mean, one of the key issues that we have is that also the West, because I can defend not the point of the Chinese, but the point of the West, is that we were certainly too overconfident about, you know, the development of those countries. And I think that we take a lot of risk in buying these countries. Of course, you had a lot of propagandists coming from the countries like China, Russia, etc. And in fact, I mean, the expectancies that we have vis-à-vis China could really fall down. I mean, even in terms of economic development, that's something that I used to say, you know, in some reports and papers. I mean, it was probably unwise also to bank too much on the development of those countries. And we have also to protect ourselves. Then we have certainly to show that in the West, and I think that was one of the purpose, with still a lot of, I would say, shortcomings of the EU, to show that we can compete, you know, with these kind of countries, that our model is more attractive, not only more attractive in terms of human rights and democracies, but also more attractive in terms of social security, in terms of security, in terms of doing business, in terms of research. And from this point of view, I wouldn't certainly bet on China in the long run.
Thank you. I am, of course, fully in agreement with both of you on the theoretical principles you discussed, but I have a real problem with Dr. Tenzer's ideological interpretation of many things. And I'm not going to it, because obviously there is no time, but with regard to COVID, the way it was dealt with regard to Ukraine and Russia, with regard to China, with regard to almost everything you said, I believe the way you look at things reflects the problems that the West has in the rest of the world because of its idiosyncratic self-assurance and its sort of ability to project itself as the party of good. And everyone else is wrong, disgraceful, because they are not sufficiently opposed to Russia. And where do you put in all that the massacres that were committed by the United States and its NATO allies in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, in Afghanistan, and I can mention many other countries, beginning with Vietnam? All that seems to be swept aside, and now suddenly the West has become a paragon of virtue and democracy. And if you look at what's happening in Africa now, as of 2 days ago in Burkina Faso, the third country that has rejected what they call French colonialism. Now, I can understand what we can accuse the Russians of, but let's not forget the context of the Ukrainian issue. I mean, we can throw numbers about the Russians killed 100,000 people. We don't know if that is true. That is a Ukrainian statistic. I can give you equivalent numbers from the Russian side. 8,000 people killed in the Donbass by the Ukrainians since 2014. So, you know, this is all very questionable and doubtful, and it looks more like a sort of a plea for Western values than for an agreement on certain universal principles. Thank you.
Well, I mean, there could be a long debate about that. I mean, certainly, I want to enter into all the points of the debates. First of all, I don't like whataboutism, which is a very common tactic of the Russian propaganda. I put it very bluntly. Certainly, I mean, I remember, as I was maybe a little bit older than most of you, the first demonstration I took part of was the demonstrations in 1973. I was 12. Against the coup in Chile, which was, at that time, we know, perfectly instrumentalized by the CIA. We know. I was a very young boy also, you know, and I was a family very against the Vietnam War. I was certainly against the invasion of Iraq. Even so, since many years, I was denouncing the atrocities committed by Saddam Hussein's regimes and the gassing of more than 100,000 people. That we must not forget. And if we consider the crimes committed by Russia, Putin's Russia, it's not about Russia, it's about the regime. We cannot compare the immensity of the crimes committed in Chechnya, in Syria, in Ukraine, in Georgia, in African countries, with the crimes, at least recent, not talking back to the 19th century, of the other powers. It's a deliberate assassinations of civilians. And we cannot laugh with that. And there, precisely, there is no relativism. And relativism is also a trick, well known, of Russian propaganda. We have just to stick to the fact, which is massive in the case of Russia: war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of aggressions, and crime of genocide. All of them being fully documented. And then you talk about the question of the universality of human rights. Precisely, I think about the question of the universality of human rights. Whoever is violating them. But there are, of course, some violations who are more enormous than others. Of course, I blame the violation of human rights of People's Republic of China in the Xinjiang, the violation of human rights by Saudi Arabia and the Emirates in Yemen, the violations of human rights by the Burman junta. There are many other examples. And as I said, I blamed already colonialisms, either by the Brits or by France. Not my point. And when I see some of my friend dissidents, some of them, very close friends, being in jail, when I see my Ukrainian friends slaughtered, and I know many of them who were slaughtered, many of them were slaughtered, many of friends of mine, daughters, sons, parents of parents whom I know quite well. There is absolutely no excuse. There is no relativism. There is no kind of, let's say, both sidesism that we could never pronounce. And any person who is backing the Russian regime, is, in a way, complicit of his crimes. I want to be very clear on that. And the fact is, because I am denouncing the crimes committed by Russia since more than 15 years, and saying to my government, saying directly to my president, and to the former president, whom I know quite well, very directly, we must stop the war, Putin's war. And the only way to stop Putin's war is to stop Putin itself. There is absolutely no other way. Any kind of complacency, of alliance, any kind of, let's say, middle way position is not acceptable. I was in Bucha in April. I was in Kiev. I had some discussion with the mayor of Bucha. I am in constant relations with my Ukrainian friends and by other friends. I am in constant relations with my Syrian friends as well. And I know some of them, who has been killed with the complicity of Iran and Russia by the Syrian regime, and sometimes killed by Russia itself. So I think I could belong on that. There is no excuse of any kind of indulging what Russia is doing. Full stop.
Yes, I just want to add something that Nicolas said in response to my friend, Comte Parpentier. I know, I've known Com for a long time, so I know where he's coming from. And I think that in the debates that we had together very privately, it's at the heart of what we were discussing tonight, actually. It's not because Americans did bad in Latin America and stopping democracy in the 50s, 60s, in killing Vietnamese, that gives us excuses us to not condemn people like Putin and Russians or Chinese for what they have been doing or they continue doing. I don't see how you put the balance, you know. I would say let's condemn both of them in what they do wrong, because we're talking about freedom and democracy, and we are on the side of the Democrats, you know. Even in the European countries, actually, people are fighting for democracy. They're not fighting for Mr. Macron. They're fighting for their democracy in France. They are fighting for democracy in Germany and in the Netherlands. So if that's the case, I think that we can say that we have to fight the evil anywhere it comes from. But we cannot, as Nicolas was saying, and actually I wanted to talk about that, but I'm not going to talk about it because he said we cannot be in moral relativism. We cannot support Taliban culture by saying, well, you know, this is a cultural affair of the Taliban people and they can do whatever they like with their women and they can beat up their women if they like. What the heck? How can you be French and say that? How can you believe in human rights and say that? How can you believe in democracy and say that? It means that it goes against all your values. So we cannot be valueless and talk about international relations. I don't think that, and this is a very dangerous point, actually. If this happens, which sometimes happens in our world, we will be back in Munich 1938, you know? And Chamberlain, and what Chamberlain did without understanding that Hitler wanted to get half of the world and to destroy the Jews. And it kind of a very naive optimism, but saying, well, we are safe and we don't care about the Czechs or others, okay? We cannot say that. So as you can see, the evolution of war in Ukraine asks us to be very alert, but at the same time to be very alert about what's going on in Russia itself. I mean, people who didn't want to get drafted They left for Georgia. Who are these people? And why don't we have what we were talking about, public opinion? There is a total absence of public opinion in Russia because they arrest people, and anyone who wants to present himself or herself against Putin very bizarrely gets killed. You know, so this is the problem that we have to have on mind and make sure that it's not going to be repeated a la Putin in Indian society or in any other society. Okay, so think twice before you applaud, and that's very, very important. Thank you.
Do we have any? Yeah.
Last question.
Hi, good evening. Thank you very much for that last question and the intense discussion that followed. I do not justify the war on Ukraine, but I do support the spirit of his question. Thank you for that, sir. Following up on that, I just wanted to clear up my ideas on democracy. So what exactly is a democracy? What actually makes a country democratic? Is US actually a democracy? US as a country which promotes surveillance as a method of control, which imprisons a particular race or a religion and then tortures them. What actually makes a country democratic? Thank you.
I think if you want, again, this is part of your democratic memory, and if you want to instruct yourself, I think the best way to know what is democracy, go back and read a very classical text, which is the funerary oration of Pericles in Thucydides, and he describes what is democracy and what does it mean to be a citizen of a democracy. And he talks about, and actually he pronounces a word, two concepts, Greek concepts, that you find also in Plato, kalos kagatos, which means beauty and good. People who know what is good, and that's, we go back to Combes Carpentier's question, what is good and what is beautiful, you know? Wherever there is no democracy, people are wicked, like in Iran. They are ugly, they are wicked, they are maleficent, you know, and they kill people who are beautiful, they are people who are good, like these kids, Iranian kids, and they are innocent, because the enemies of democracy, like Stalin, Hitler, and many others that are today, they don't like beauty and they don't like people who are good.
Yes, I think that I agree with Ramin, I mean, as usual, but I would add just saying, I mean, the questions, democracy is a country in which, first of all, the people who express their own views are not persecuted. First of all. I mean, that could be negative, but I mean, that's the basis of everything. And basically, that's not the case in Iran, that's not the case in Syria, that's not the case in China, that's not the case in Russia, etc. I mean, first of all. Second, that there is, I mean, as I said, the reverence to the truth, to the science, to educations, and the capacity of the people of just also learn from their own failures or guilt. That's what Germany did after, I mean, it takes time, it was maybe not perfect, after World War II. And remember, I mean, the speech by that time President Richard von Weizsäcker on 8th of May 1985, so 40 years after the end of World War II, where he expressed a guilt for what Germany's did during Hitler's time. And I think that's a true question also for Chinese, for the Russians, for many other countries, also for the US, also for France, but US and France did when it comes to some period of time, to Vietnam War, to the slavery in the US, to the colonialism in France, to the Vichy period in France, and what China and Russia, Syria never did, which is just to acknowledge the guilt. And I think that when there will be the Tiananmen, before the Tiananmen Square, when there will be in China a monument to the victims of Tiananmen repressions, then China will be free. When there will be on the Red Square in Moscow two monuments, one of the victims of Stalinism, the other to the victims of Putinism, then Russia will be free. And the same when you have, you know, in Damascus, a monument for the victims of Assad regime. I could, of course, enumerate I can talk about many other countries as well. And the same, of course, for Iran. I mean, the victims of the repressions, ongoing repression and before repression, there must be this kind of thing. As we have, I mean, also, you know, in France, you know, a memory of the victims of the Veldiv when you had, with the complicity of the French police, and ordered by the Vichy regime, the deportations of youth in France to Germany. I mean, that's basically democracy. And when also, I would add, last thing, because there are many other things that I could say, but it would be too long. When, I mean, those kind of things, the crimes committed, matter for the people, are present in the mind of the people. And for me, that's basically democracy, because it will speak volumes about the ability to be free and to express this feeling of guilt. And this feeling of guilt, I think, is probably a kind of propedeutic to democracy.
Thank you. Obviously, this debate could last longer and maybe all night, I'm sure. But I would like really to thank all of you, of course. Professor Tenzer, Professor Jahanbegloo, and Dr. Krishna Swamy. I'm very proud. It's, again, Alliance Française has proved itself to be a place when we can debate on, with lots of freedom, and that was the proof tonight. So I'm sure that we will have many more debates. Professor Tenzer is taking a plane tonight. I'm sure that, I hope that maybe we're speaking about having another go at this sort of debate in January, February. And all of you, of course, are are invited for the second part, Freedom number 2 in 2023. Thank you very much.